The latest in Husky recruits and recruiting around the country. You're locked on.
You are Locked On UConn, your daily podcast on the UConn Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks for making Locked On UConn your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Before we dive into today's show, just want to take a quick moment to ask for a small favor. If you're enjoying the content, please take a second to subscribe and follow the audio versions wherever you listen. It helps the show grow, and I truly appreciate all of the support. Every follow, every subscription, every download, like, share, all of that helps create more revenue for UConn NIL, because Locked On UConn is probably the only podcast that's donating 10% of all revenue to Bleeding Blue for Good. Yes, we're supporting the UConn NIL programs. So by supporting this show, you're directly supporting UConn's efforts in NIL and their athletic program. Thank you for being a part of this community. We really appreciate it. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Okay, as promised, I tweeted a little bit about this yesterday. We're going to talk about Jacob Furphy. We're going to talk about Braylon Mullins, Eric Reibe, the latest on that, to bring in our friend of the program, Sam Lance. He is a recruiting expert for Zag's blog. And I believe, Sam, you're working also with Field of 68, doing some other stuff there too, correct?
Yes, sir. I'll be writing the daily tonight for Thursday morning and for the rest of the year. And then I do the the Kansas Hoops podcast for the Field of 68 as well.
All right, cool. Well, let's dive right into it, man. We have some excited UConn fans. They get Darius Adams, 5-star from New Jersey originally, out of Indiana, the prep school there. Want to get an idea of where we stand with kind of, I think the three that the three that most people are interested in are Braylon Mullins, who makes a decision next Tuesday. I'm doing a live show with Locked On Hoosiers. We feel like it's an IU UConn head-to-head there, with North Carolina trailing behind there. Let's start there. Let's start with Braylon.
Yeah, I think you kind of hit it on the head there. From everything that I've heard, this is kind of a two-horse race right now between UConn and Indiana. It really does get interesting for UConn with having Darius Adams already locked up, because, of course, Mullins and Adams play similar position, kind of that off guard, that two kind of guard. So could be very interesting to see where Mullins decides to go. I still think if he chooses UConn, the two of those players could play pretty easily side by side together. But yeah, Mullins, he's just one of the pure shooters in the class. He really fits UConn like really well. I think he'd be a great ad for UConn. And of course, he took the official to UConn in early August. He's also taken North Carolina and Indiana in September here. No more visits left for him in decision-making mode. We'll find out next Tuesday where he's going, but right now it looks like a race between UConn and Indiana.
Yeah, no, my interesting tidbit on that is I think what UConn is, this is what I've heard. This isn't straight from anybody on the staff, but what I've heard is that they're pitching Darius and Braylon best backcourt in the country eventually, right? And also, as a segue into who we're going to talk about next, Eric Reibe, as bringing him in as well, and potentially having the number one recruiting class in the country coming to stores with those all of those, and I'm going to ask you this because you're a recruiting guy. I've heard 5-star Eric, I've heard 4-star, I've heard 5-star Darius, I've heard 4-star. I don't care personally. I know Dan Hurley and his staff doesn't care because they just want the players. They don't care about the distinctions. Get that out of the way right now. What is it just based off of, whether it's on 3, 24/7, Is that all it is? That it's those rankings can vary? Is that really what it is?
Yeah, for me personally, if I ever ride on somebody, I just look at what the highest ranking is and
Right.
give that to them, because I think they deserve it. I think 247 is kind of odd too because they have the regular rankings, which I believe has 16 5 stars, and then they have the composite rankings, which has 24 5 stars, if I'm not mistaken. And then on three is its whole other world. So you know what? Let's just call them all 5 stars. We might as well.
So that's what I'm hearing is that the push for these three individuals is kind of like playing off of each other, which is not just saying, hey, Darius, you're coming in and doing this, not Braylon, you're coming in and doing this. It's like we want all three of you. We want all three of you to form the best recruiting class in the country. Let's talk about Eric Reibe as one of those triumvirate there. What have you heard lately? How's UConn's position there? And speak on it.
Yeah, I've actually heard a lot of good things with UConn and Reibe. He's down to a top 5 now. I believe he just announced that yesterday or the day before. So he now has Creighton, Indiana, Kansas, Oregon, and UConn as his finalists. He's visited all of those schools, the most recent one being Oregon this past weekend. Really, with Reibe, I could see him choosing any of these schools. I mean, he right now, Creighton, after that Creighton visit, was said to have a lot of momentum, and Creighton has been in to see him multiple times since that visit. Indiana, of course, they have a pretty good track record with big men. Mike Woodson likes to play around the big, so I could see him picking that. And then whenever he took the Kansas visit, a big thing was him kind of being that heir to Hunter Dickinson for Kansas. He's another lefty big man, very similar playing style to Hunter Dickinson. But UConn, I actually have heard after that visit, they picked up a lot of momentum, and UConn is really in there. I would probably classify this right now as a battle between Kansas, UConn, and Creighton if I had to kind of pick a top 3. And I think UConn's surely in a good position. I mean, they can flex Donovan Clingan while they're not the same player. Reibe, I think, is more of your kind of skilled, kind of stretch it a little bit type of big man, not really your dominant low post presence like Clingan was. But yeah, I think UConn has a really good shot. There's no decision date or anything like that for Reibe yet, but that could probably be coming here pretty soon. And I'd expect probably either UConn, Kansas, or Creighton for that one.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing too, man. That confirms some of that stuff. And I want to jump into kind of an unknown. I got a message from a scout that I'm very close with yesterday afternoon-ish and said, I'm hearing Jacob Furphy to UConn. And I was just like, oh, Australian, you're familiar with his brother, went to Kansas, who's now in the pros. So Johnny Furfy, if people aren't initiated. And I honestly will be the first to say that I wasn't familiar with Jacob's game and wasn't even thinking that UConn was looking at international prospects, although I should have, because they'll look under a rock to find talent. You know what I mean? This staff will go to all lengths. So did a deep dive on him, and he fits. Also, this other is something else that irks me about the recruiting stuff, which is I've seen him listed at 6'6", 6'5", 6'4". He's at least 6'4". That's one thing I know. He's a incredibly smooth left-handed shooting player. He reminds me a little bit of Luke Kennard if I'm using a comp of a player that just got drafted a few years back, played at Duke, has had a successful NBA career. 210 pounds. He's already built like a pro. He's not like a high school kid that's 150 pounds, a la either Braylon or Darius. I think they're about the same. I think he's a great fit at UConn just based off of his profile and some of the things I've seen in transition, his ability to get to the basket, 3-level scorer. What are your thoughts about him? I know that he's visited Illinois. I know that they're in the mix. Potentially, even Kansas is looking at him. So I don't know, man. Like I think it would be a good fit. I think it kind of came out of left field, and I think that's also kind of a Dan Hurley special.
Yeah, I don't know much about Jacob Furphy. It's kind of a new name that has kind of emerged for me, kind of on my radar. Uh, Obviously, you mentioned he visited the Illini. He's a lefty, which I really like those kind of lefty shooters. I just think it looks so pure whenever you have a really nice lefty shooter like that. But yeah, I mean, he was in the Australia's NBL One East, a semi-pro league, and there he averaged 13 points and 4.8 rebounds, and he also knocked down 45% of his shots from three-point range. So it seems to me like he's kind of one of those guys who can be college ready right away, and I think that would be a good fit. And because we're going to mention later that UConn might be kind of looking for some names to fill out the roster next year, he could be someone to do that. And just so you know, he is not related to Johnny Furphy.
He's not?
He's not related to Johnny Furphy of Kansas. He's not.
How dare you? How dare you correct me on a perfectly cool assumption?
That would be awesome.
It would be.
I would love to know there's another Furphy, because then if that's so, bring him to Kansas.
Yeah, I know, and I've heard that Kansas is in the mix for him too, which is interesting. That's wild to me that he's not related to him. That's a surname that you would think that automatically that is it's together.
I've actually heard this is a funny story, and this actually might be who my friend Greg Gurley is talking about. He does play-by-play for Kansas radio, and he said last year, whenever Bill Self was recruiting Johnny Furphy, he kind of went and talked to him about him. He's like, "Oh yeah, I love his game. A nice left-handed shooter." And Bill was like, "He's not a lefty. He's a righty." And then Greg realized he was looking at the wrong Furphy. So maybe this is the Furphy that they were looking at the whole time. Who knows?
That's wild. Well, real quick, I before we get into Akaden Lewis, I think Jacob could be a handful in the pros. Even just looking at some of the tape. Forget about the shooting. Him in transition is a beast. Just getting downhill, getting to the rim. He's a better athlete than what people would probably think, coming from Australia. And honestly, if UConn's in the mix and that's getting momentum, could be a really big sleeper. I've heard if he was an American recruit, he would easily be a 4-star, likely touching a 5-star. So that's what we're talking about. So all right, let's talk about Akaden Lewis before we move on to the second segment. What's the latest on Akaden?
Yeah, so Akaden has taken a couple visits recently, has scheduled Kentucky for Big Blue Madness, and then he took Duke during their craziness, countdown to craziness event. And he's down to those two schools and UConn now. He eliminated North Carolina from the list. My guess there would be because they already have a guy like Derek Dixon to kind of run the point guard for them in that class. But yeah, it's coming down to it for Akaden Lewis. I would expect that after the Kentucky visit, we'll probably see some sort of announcement date pop up for him. But really, I think all three schools are kind of in play right now. I mean, Duke is kind of the wild card. The Boozers haven't decided yet. I think a lot of things can change if Cameron and Caden Boozer go to Duke. I don't really see Duke as a possibility for Akaden Lewis. But Kentucky is right there for Akaden Lewis, and we kind of know about Caleb Wilson's little recruiting pitch. If you don't know, they kind of had all these interactions on social media that made it really seem like the two of them were trying to team up and join Kentucky. But UConn is still right there for Akaden Lewis. I mean, they don't have a true one right now, and that's what Akaden Lewis is. He's, I think, your kind of true point guard. And UConn doesn't have that in this class. I wouldn't say Darius Adams is a point guard. I wouldn't say Braylon Mullins is really your point guard either, even though he can play on the ball. So Akaden Lewis really could be the guy for UConn to kind of round out this class. But yeah, I think UConn's surely in a great spot for him. I think it's probably UConn, Kentucky for Akaden Lewis.
I am of the assumption that he's leaning Kentucky, because even if you look at the dynamics of UConn, maybe not in this class, but they do have Ahmad Noel as a freshman this year, who's a true number one, and can play a little off the ball, but in a position in the positionless world that Dan Hurley likes to live in. He's the closest to a 1 versus a 2 there. So that some of that obviously plays into it. So I'm leaning Kentucky there. Kaden, you're more than welcome to come to UConn, so don't think that I don't want you. But yeah, I think that's the case there. But this has been an incredible first segment. I really appreciate you going over some players of interest, if you will. When we return, we're going to talk about what's next, including some potential surprise visits from some major recruits to UConn, but also would love to hear your thoughts kind of about recruiting around the country, where people are going. And we'll talk about that with Sam Lance coming up after this. Hey, everyone. Before we move on, I'm going to add a graphic to the screen that's going to take away my face. So for some of you who don't like my face, this will be a good promo for you. And talk about Americares. It's a Connecticut-based nonprofit that I've partnered with to give my listeners an option they trust in giving donations to those affected by Hurricane Helene. The storm left a trail of destruction, destroying homes, businesses, flooding communities, and leaving survivors without power or running water. So this Connecticut-based Americares is on the ground right now in the hardest hit communities, including Western North Carolina, my adopted state, restoring access to health services, delivering medicine, water, relief supplies, and helping to keep health clinics open. There's a long recovery ahead. Americares is going to be there to support in need for Hurricane Helene, but also Hurricane Milton, which is vastly approaching Florida quickly. Together, we can improve health in the time of crisis. To learn more about Americares hurricane relief efforts or donate, go to americares.org. It's your old friends at FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view the live play-by-play, and so much more on the exact same page you place your bets. So you'll get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Check them out to get started. All right, we're back with Sam Lance of Zags Blog and Field of 68. Sam, there are lots of names in this recruiting class. Some have been linked to UConn, some have not. What are your thoughts about Malik Thomas? Originally linked to UConn. I mean, crystal ball, I had him going to UConn initially. You know, he had that nice little back and forth with Dan Hurley. I think you reported about that. And what's happened there? What's happened there? Because I had you on mute.
Yeah, I think really there, the most recent thing to keep an eye on is that Arkansas visit that he took. And since that visit, I've seen all over the place that many people are speculating that Malik Thomas will end up there. What happened with UConn? To be honest, I'm really not completely sure. I mean, whenever I was at Peach Jam, it really seemed like it was a match made in heaven.
Yeah.
You know, like Dan Hurley was there pretty much every single game for Malik. He was there all the time supporting Malik. And I think their personalities really do mesh very well, Dan Hurley and Malik Thomas. But I'm really not sure what happened. I think Arkansas just kind of really picked up the pace with recruiting him, and John Calipari got pretty serious about that. And pairing him with Darius Acuff, I mean, that backcourt would be pretty special. So I think right now Malik Thomas is probably an Arkansas lean, and UConn's probably out of the picture.
Yeah, and I want to kind of be very careful and clarify this. Like, I think I don't even know if anything actually nothing happened. Like, it could just be, you know, like, what's the word? There could just be a battle of attrition, right? Where, you know, the team that kind of leads initially doesn't always get the recruit in the end. And I think that's the case here with UConn. I think you would probably tend to agree with that. Also, I don't think anyone at UConn has an issue with Overtime Elite, but I do feel like Overtime Elite has a better relationship with John Calipari, and thus kind of pushes its players to go to places where they feel like those relationships are taken care of. Yeah. Would you agree?
Yeah, probably so. Probably so.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, listen, if Malik Thomas announces tomorrow that he's going to UConn, come on board, baby. We got room for you. Everyone will be super excited. So I just don't want anyone to think that people at UConn don't want him or I don't want him. I would love him. So, but it's not looking good for UConn in that respect. All right, let's jump to a name that I like, and I think he is a really interesting prospect, Nico Bundalo. I believe he obviously visited UConn. My favorite thing about Nico Bundalo has nothing to do with basketball. It's his dad's ponytail, and I want his dad on the sidelines in that parent group at UConn. Some really special parents have come through. Seems like a really cool dude. I just think it would be hysterical to have a dad with a ponytail that's like rooting his tail off for his son. What can you tell us about Nico?
Yeah, Nico is kind of really an interesting recruitment. He has a top 8 right now. He has Kentucky, Michigan State, North Carolina, Ohio State, Pitt, Texas, UConn, and Xavier. And then he's also added Kansas to the mix. That was kind of reported a while ago. Still no visit or anything planned there. But yeah, there's a lot of schools involved right now, but I think that it's kind of really narrowing down actually for Nico, what schools are really involved. He took UConn. We mentioned that already. He took Michigan State in September, Ohio State in September, and then he just took North Carolina this past weekend. The thing with Bundalo, I think right now that top 8 isn't really top 8. It's probably more UConn, North Carolina, Ohio State are kind of in there right now. I would say those are probably the top 3. And I think UConn's in a good position with Bundalo. He added a Kentucky visit and now apparently won't end up taking that visit. So I guess he's done with his official visits now. So it looks like he could be in decision-making mode. And I think it's going to be between those schools that he's visited. So I think we'll get a lot more from Nico Bundalo here upcoming. But he's one of those guys that his camp kind of keeps things quiet. There's not really a lot of information out there right now on Nico.
Let me ask you this question. This is totally kind of off the cuff because I've heard plenty of people talk about this. Like when a player puts out like a top 8 or top 12 or whatever it is, are there teams that they kind of throw out there that maybe the team's interest isn't as high as their interest?
I'm sure that happens. I'm sure that happens a lot. Some people might even put XYZ school on their list to maybe drive up their NIL price, things of that nature. So yeah, I think it's definitely a thing in recruiting nowadays for sure.
And then one more question on, not necessarily on that, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. Have you heard of anybody? You don't have to give me specifics. Give me names. I don't want to put anybody on Front Street. But have you heard of anybody that they put a top 5 up and they want to go to one school and they go to that school and they say, okay, I'm yours, and that school goes, well, maybe we'll think about it. Like, we like you. Maybe you came to visit, but it's not like an automatic slam dunk. Like just because that XYZ school that they want to go to, it has to be a mutual fit. That's pretty accurate, right?
I've heard that some kids do get put on ice sometimes. Like maybe let's say they're being recruited for a certain position and the school is recruiting somebody else who they like more at their position. I've heard things like that happening as well, too, where schools are like, well, maybe wait a second because we're seeing about this guy, and then kind of going from there.
The old, I'll take you to the prom if I get a no from the prettiest girl in school. Yeah. I'll take you afterwards, but I got to shoot my shot first, and then we'll come back to you. That's kind of the prevailing theme there.
That is a very good way to put it.
All right. Well, I'm just going from my personal experience because shoot or shoot. All right. Last one. This is a big one, and this is I've heard this, and I can't get this confirmed anywhere. So you tell me I'm crazy. You tell me I'm out of my depth with this, but I've heard through some folks, and it's been multiple people now, that similar to what UConn tried to do with Cooper Flagg, they may try to do the same thing with Nate Ament, which is bring him in for a late visit, see if they can woo him away from the Dukes, the Virginias that he's in the mix with right now. What are the chances of that? And have you heard anything about that?
I personally have not heard anything linking Ament to UConn, but Nate Ament is one of those dudes where this decision is going to stretch out to the spring. So really, like, anything can happen. I mean, Kansas has been out to see him about 1 million times, and he still doesn't have a visit set to Kansas. So you never know with Nate Ament. He does have Louisville, Tennessee, and then Kansas State is scheduled for February 11th. So that just kind of tells you what his decision timeline is right now. He has a visit in February. So anything can happen with this one, Mark. I mean, it's such a long ways away. And in about a couple weeks, there's not really going to be many people in the top 10 who are, who haven't committed already.
Right.
He's going to be one of those guys that definitely all the top schools are going to be after him once he really gets in decision-making mode. So anything can happen with Nate Ament, in my opinion, at this point. He's only taken Texas and Duke so far, Duke during the Countdown to Craziness event. And Duke is, of course, kind of seen as that leader right now. But if the Boozers go to Duke, that could change a lot of things for Nate Ament specifically.
So I want to ask you, do you think the Boozers are going to go to Duke? You think that's a done deal, or you think it's a flip of a coin between them and Miami?
I honestly think it's a flip of a coin, and it was originally reported by us at Zags Blog that the announcement would come tomorrow. We were kind of hearing that may not be the case. We're hearing, maybe tomorrow or Friday, but that announcement is coming soon, and I will tell you, the dominoes will start to fall whenever the Boozers decide. Like, it's just everything's going to start rolling once they decide. Hopefully that comes this week. But, yeah, I have no idea. I feel like it could be Miami or Duke, and maybe even the Boozers don't know at this point.
Last question before we get to the last segment. This is kind of like a random wild card. Are your Jayhawks gonna snag Devonsa?
No.
You don't think so?
I don't think so.
Where do you think he's gonna go? I'm curious. I know he's easily the number one recruit in the class.
Yeah, I would say he's going to BYU this weekend, and that's his last visit. I mean, BYU getting an unofficial visit and his last visit. It's kind of pointing to BYU. I've also heard that AJ kind of wants to be like, a guy that, brings the program, like is the guy for the program and kind of brings them to new heights. So I could see BYU, another program that kind of goes along those lines, because as I know, as a Kansas fan, they have never won a national championship in the history of their school. Kansas State, I hear, is also right there for AJ Devonsa. So I would honestly, at this point, expect one of those two to be probably the place that he goes.
There's a lot of NIL money between those two schools, so that makes a ton of sense to me. All right, when we come back, the idea of a super class for Dan Hurley and UConn, maybe not what you think. Let's talk about that with Sam Lance coming up after this. What's up, UConn fans? We may be on a bye week, but now's the perfect time to secure those tickets for next Saturday, October 19th, as the Huskies take on the Demon Deacons of Wake Forest in a nationally televised showdown. Kickoff is at noon, and with all the excitement around campus, this one is something that you don't want to miss. Plus, the school is doing giveaways, so this ticket might actually be a little tougher than you think. Don't worry, that's where you have game time. And there's a deal just for you. It's the promo code is Locked On College at checkout to get $20 off your first purchase. Don't wait. Get those tickets now and be part of the action as UConn takes on Wake Forest. Promo code Locked On College for $20 off. Get in the game. Let's show our Huskies some love on the football side. All right, let's bring back Adam. Sorry, I'll just call you Adam Zagora. No, I'm not going to do that. Sam Lance, let's unmute you from Zag's blog. I was trying to get that out of my brain. But Adam also is welcome on the show anytime, as well as you are, Sam. So this idea, I messaged to you before the show and just said, I want you to understand what I mean about the idea of a super class. UConn is not going to be a one and done factory. ever. As long as Dan Hurley is at the helm, he is not going to get 5 guys that are just going to come in all 5 stars and then peace out. He typically will get 1, maybe 2 guys that have that distinction. This year's person of interest would be Liam McNeely. 5-star, Monteverdi, great pedigree, could potentially be a lottery pick if he has the year that most people think he's going to have. So with that being said, you lose Alex Caravan, Samson Johnson, Hassan Diarra. That's 3. Potentially Liam McNeely, 4. Then if you have 1, like he's thinking, I mean, at a coach's breakfast yesterday, he said Jaden Ross was playing like a top 20 NBA pick. That's their 8th or 9th guy on their team at this point, based off of projections. So if UConn has the players that make the leap from their freshman to sophomore season, you could lose 6, potentially 7 guys. What's to stop UConn from saying, you know what? I hate the transfer portal. We're finding our quote-unquote superclass with this class coming up.
Yeah, I think that's a really realistic possibility for UConn. And there's a lot of guys that they're in on that I don't think are necessarily those one-and-done guys, even though they'll be really, really good college players. Like Darius Adams, I don't think he's a guy that's going to go into UConn and score, 15 points right away and be a draft pick. I think he's a guy that by maybe his sophomore, junior year, you're seeing those types of things. But I think that's kind of consistent with the people that UConn's recruiting right now. I think Mullins would maybe be that only exception that I think could possibly go right away NBA that UConn's recruiting. So I think it's a very real possibility that they could bring in a bigger class. And, we always forget that it's going to be 15-man rosters, 15 scholarship spots, I believe, starting next year, too, with the new NCAA rules. So take them all if you can. If you can take them all, you might as well with the new rule.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And that's a great point about the 15-man roster. The idea of, I think people get so enamored initially with the last couple seasons. And I there is 100% of connective tissue from how they're handling their business, but no more COVID years. It's going to be a lot harder to find that kind of senior transfer to come in for 1 year, unless you're going to look in like mid-major areas and players in that distinction. So knowing that Dan Hurley likes to build these relationships and build these kind of long-term growth plans for these players, that's kind of his superpower. Like he's essentially, gearing up for that. So a guy like a Jacob Furfy, a guy that I mentioned, like Nate Ament, who will likely be a one and done. But if you mix like a 1 or 2 one and dones with a class of 4 or 5 guys, you don't lose the same continuity that he brings. So basically what we're saying is, and let's see if you agree, is that if UConn's in on a player just because they play the same position, like Braylon and like Darius, it doesn't mean that one of the two cancel them out, or like a kid like Jacob Furphy from Australia.
Yeah, I think you've kind of seen it with UConn. They have all sorts of guards who can go and do different things on these past 2 national championship teams. So being a guard in the UConn system has to be just an absolute dream. I mean, it just has to be. So if you're a guy like Darius Adams, Eric Reibe, Nico Bundalo, just any of these guys in general, I mean, Dan Hurley has shown that he can develop talent and get guys to the NBA. I mean, Clingan, he was freshman, kind of contributed, and then boom, the next year he's right up there amongst the top picks in the NBA draft. So I think Hurley can really use that to his advantage, kind of that pitch of being able to develop guys, and be able to have the real conversation with them. Like, hey, you might not produce this year, you might not produce right away, but give me 2 years, 3 years with you, and I could turn you into an NBA guy. I think it's a great pitch for Dan Hurley to have, and I think we're going to see it with a guy like Solomon Ball this year. I've heard great things about his progression. If he takes that jump and he goes, I'm looking at Darius Adams and Braylon Mullins if I'm Dan Hurley and saying, this is exactly what you guys can do.
Yeah, no, I think that'll end up being the continued pitch when we start talking about the 2016 class, which is like, hey, I took a guy that not necessarily no one heard of, but the national media probably didn't hear of, and was a 4-star recruit, and now he's playing for the Celtics or whoever drafts him, because he had such a leap from freshman to sophomore year. So I think that is 100%. And then the other aspect of this is that doesn't get talked about enough is UConn's offense is run very similar to the way Euroleagues run it, the way NBA teams run it, in particular the Golden State Warriors. So the idea that you could come into UConn off of an AAU, off of a Australia team, off of a high school career, and be almost leveled into what is likely kind of like an NBA factory of learning a very difficult offense, makes you even more attractive and pro ready for when you are draft eligible.
Did anybody 2 years ago think that Cam Spencer would ever get drafted?
Nope. Tristan Newton.
Nope.
The list can go on. I mean, you could say Steph Castle would go anywhere. Like I even said, Steph made his draft stock more palatable by going to UConn, because he showed things that most 5-stars don't do, which is I'll sit at the beginning of the year, I'll come off the bench, and then I'll start. I'll have a game where I essentially just lock down, Mark Sears or whoever, who's the point guard I'm facing. And then now you're seeing him dunking on people in the NBA. It's just,
and scoring like 20 whatever in the Final Four probably helps too.
Yeah, that's the thing, is that he probably could have done that every game, but he didn't need to. That's what makes this so special. And I could gush about this all day, but you have a job to do, and so do I. So this has been a great episode, man. I really appreciate it. Although I'm going to, before we decide to sign off for the day, I want to get your predictions on, in particular, the 3 that I feel like we have the best shots with. What are if you had to, not to say gun to your head, but like, life depended on it, Braylon Mullins is going to where?
I mean, I think just with the way that kind of Woodson has, what everybody says in this Discord I'm in, has been shoved into a locker a lot recently. I think that UConn might shove Woodson into a locker again and pick up Mullins. I think a realistic class really could be Adams, Mullins, Reibe, and Bundalo. I think that could be pretty realistic for UConn at this moment.
And then maybe an Australian surprise with Furfy on the back end. I heard Furphy's making a decision quickly, so it could influence some things. Who knows? All right, man. Well, listen, we got you on record. Don't hurl profanity at Sam Lance on X if he's wrong or right, or do it. Just engagement's fun too. Listen, this has been another episode of Locked On UConn. For Sam Lance of Zag's blog and Field of 68, I'm Mark Snetto, asking you to stay locked in, stay connected. Make sure that toughness meter is always rising. And as always, go Huskies.